For more than a quarter century, Japanese carmakers sought greater entry to the American auto market. But in 1981, the U.S. and Japan agreed to voluntary export restraints, VERs, to stop the increase in the number of Japanese cars on U.S. roads. How well did the VERs work? The first Japanese cars imported to the U.S. were more curiosities than competition. Sure, they were fuel efficient, but with gas under 30 cents a gallon, who was worried about mileage? The 70s changed the equation. War and strife in the Middle East doubled gas prices, then doubled them again. Now gas prices mattered, and American drivers were trying Japanese imports and liking what they found. Sales lost to Japanese imports meant profits and jobs lost to the U.S. auto industry. The auto industry looked to Washington for help and got a sympathetic hearing, especially from industrial state congressmen like Detroit's John Dingell.
So I felt it was absolutely necessary, in view of the grotesquely unfair trade practices of our trading partners, especially the Japanese, that real quotas and domestic content requirements equal to those of other nations should be laid in place by the United States.
To free trade advocates like Washington think tank economist Robert Crandall, higher trade barriers might protect auto workers in the short term, but wouldn't solve the auto industry's fundamental problems.
I rather think that the protection for workers in that industry defeats the purpose. To the extent that we protect those workers and protect that industry and keep an umbrella over their prices, their profits, and their wage rates, there's no incentive for them to reform.
But concerned congressmen and worried workers swung more weight than eminent economists, with Reagan administration officials like Trade Representative William Brock.
Congress started talking about passing a bill to hold imports to maybe half the present level. So we talked to the Japanese and we said, look, it takes 5, 6, 7 years to retool to a completely new market demand. And we suggested that it would be appreciated if they restrained for a limited period of time, 3 or 4 years. They did.
The voluntary export restraints cut Japanese imports to the U.S. by almost 8%. Were VERs performing as advertised? Did fewer Japanese imports mean more American jobs?
The import share from Japan was about 20% of the U.S. market. It's currently 16 or so percent. Costly.
Stephen Beckman, an economist for the Auto Workers Union.
If the 4 or 5% of the U.S. market was not available to the domestic companies, their profitability and their employment would be far lower than it is now. And so putting a number of jobs on that is pretty difficult, but I'd say it's probably in the range of 100,000 jobs.
American jobs may have been saved by the export restraints, but fewer Japanese imports meant higher prices. Importers pushed prices higher still by importing more expensive models with more accessories than before to keep profits up in spite of selling fewer cars. The prices of American cars went up too, as U.S. manufacturers discovered that they could increase their prices too, as long as they stayed just under Japanese prices. Just how much had American car buyers paid for the jobs saved by voluntary export restraints?
How much did it cost American consumers in terms of higher prices of automobiles in order to keep one additional job in and around Detroit? And the answer was, by my calculation, somewhere around $160,000. That may sound high to you, but almost every calculation of the effect of trade restraints on employment levels in the United States comes out with something around $100,000 or $200,000 per job. It's not unusual.
The VERs triggered a decade of change for the U.S. auto industry. Detroit's Big Three responded as intended to Japanese competition by cutting payrolls and cutting the size of its cars. But the VERs had unintended consequences as well. In order to keep profits up in the face of the import limits, Japan introduced new lines of larger, more luxurious cars, penetrating a market previously dominated by U.S. brands like Cadillac and Lincoln. Japan started to make more cars in U.S. plants, cars not subject to the import restrictions. The market was bringing the competing auto industries closer together, until it was sometimes hard to tell them apart.
Same here. That's because they came off the same assembly line. 5-speed or optional automatic? Uh-huh. Dual airbag? Dual airbags. So what's the difference?
One thing hadn't changed. Big Three auto executives still wanted Japan to hold down the number of cars it shipped to the U.S., and Japan was still agreeing. After more than 10 years of voluntary export restraints, what was the bottom line? The union that represented auto workers rated the VERs a success.
U.S. industry has fundamentally really revised the way it functions. And it's been done in a very short period of time. It was done because the restraints provided some modicum of assurance that there would still be a market here for U.S. companies at the end of that adjustment process.
But for consumer representatives, the VERs were a net loss.
Consumers for the last 10 years have paid several $100s a car more for a new car, whether it's a foreign car or whether it's a domestic make, simply because of these VERs. And that is part of the problem we face today, and when we are absolutely astounded at the price of a new car.
The VERs were a trade-off then. People who made and sold cars got more jobs and breathing space to adjust to the realities of a new international auto industry. But the vastly larger number of people who bought cars picked up the tab for the jobs and the breathing room. A decade of higher-priced cars, Japanese and American.